When you hear that your mother is sent to death row to be executed, what is that like when you hear that?
It was very, very devastating.
John Lucio is fighting for the freedom of his mother, Melissa Lucio, who he says was sentenced to death for a crime she did not commit. A victim, he says, of racial injustice who should not be on death row here in Texas.
I wasn't guilty, and this was an accident.
The State of Texas versus Melissa is a documentary credited for alerting the public to Melissa Lucio's story. In 2008, Lucio, a mother of 14 children, became the first Latina sentenced to death in Texas. According to police reports, she was charged with murder in the death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, who was found at home with several bruises on her body. But according to witnesses, among them Lucio's own children, Lucio's daughter Mariah had accidentally fallen on her own down these stairs while the family was moving and died 2 days later.
You know something is wrong.
No, sir, I don't.
You know something.
Lucio's lawyers say the police detectives, instead of investigating the true cause of Mariah's injuries from falling down the stairs, verified by independent forensic specialists for the defense, immediately blamed Lucio for her daughter's injuries.
If I beat you half to death, like that little child was beat, I bet you'd die too.
So I did not beat my daughter, sir.
No?
I'm not that cruel to my children.
What are those bruises on your little child?
Interrogating her for several hours, forcing her to show how she might have harmed her daughter by having Lucio beat on this doll that her lawyers say had nothing to do with her daughter Mariah's cause of death, which again was by accidentally falling down these stairs. Lucio's attorneys say Lucio's own children say she never touched her daughter Mariah, and that Lucio had never been arrested before for abusing any of her children.
They wanted to hear something. I mean, I was not going to admit to causing her death because I wasn't responsible.
However, Lucio was ultimately forced by police to make a false confession that she was responsible for her daughter's injuries and death, when in truth they say she was not responsible at all. Her capital murder conviction has resulted in Lucio sitting on death row since 2008. Her supporters believe she has been innocent all along and question why she was sentenced to death in the first place, considering she had no history of abusing any of her children. She was scheduled for execution by lethal injection on April 27, 2022. John, her eldest son, among many supporters around the world, pleading with Texas authorities not to kill her.
I don't want my mom to be executed. I don't want to lose it.
John celebrated when Lucio was granted a last-minute stay of execution by a state court on April 25, 2022.
I know my mother did not murder my sister Mariah. My mother has 14 children. My mother, she was not the person to hurt anybody.
Lucio presently remains here on death row at this women's prison in Gatesville, Texas, 2 hours south of Dallas. Her attorneys are demanding she be allowed a new trial, claiming the state relied on false evidence and hid favorable evidence to convict her. Her son John says he believes that his mother's race as a Mexican-American played a role in how authorities rushed to judgment against her, and says he questions why his mother's white defense attorney chose not to inform the jury that Lucio's own children told him she didn't harm her daughter Mariah.
Race plays a factor because from the very beginning, I mean, once they arrested my mother, she was guilty. Very, very prejudiced.
Though it's important to mention that both the prosecuting district attorney and the judge in Lucio's case were Hispanic. Lucio's supporters point out that the prosecuting district attorney at the time was running for U.S. Congress, needing a, quote, big win to convince voters he was tough on crime.
Yes, sir, he needed a win. He was actually going for congressman, and he needed a win.
This same district attorney was later convicted and sentenced himself to prison on bribery and corruption charges.
and he did a lot of corruption. He did a lot of briberies. He had dealt with the cartels. Mexico was just literally minutes away from the courthouse. He was a very, very illegal district attorney, very, very corrupt.
Not long ago, a group opposing the death penalty produced this mock execution film. Presently, there are more than 2,400 men and women on death row in the U.S. Capital punishment is legal in 27 U.S. states, including in federal cases and within the U.S. military. And there's a study of more than 500 Californians that found white jurors were more likely to sentence poor Latino defendants to death than poor white defendants. The report concludes that racial disparities are present at every stage of a capital case and get magnified as a case moves through the legal process. Exposing how the system discriminates in capital cases, according to the report, can shine an important light on law enforcement and judicial practices in vital need, it says, of abolition, restructuring, or reform. However, one of the nation's leading supporters of the death penalty, Kent Scheidegger of the Criminal Justice Legal Foundation, reminds people that a majority of U.S. citizens still support the death penalty as an appropriate punishment in capital murder cases.
I think the main reason would be that there are some crimes that are so exceptionally heinous that anything less is just a miscarriage of justice.
He says a good example of someone who deserves the death penalty is self-described white supremacist Peyton Gendron, who was charged with targeting and shooting and murdering several African Americans in Buffalo, New York on May 14th, 2022.
You know, that's a good example. Someone going out to hunt people and to try to kill as many people as he can, just out of pure hate. To give him a constitutional right to food, clothing, shelter, and medical care for the rest of his life would be a travesty.
And he strongly argues that the death penalty is not applied in a racially biased manner, by virtue, he says, of a much larger percentage of white inmates on death row.
No, the death penalty is not applied in a racially biased manner. If you compare the demographics of death row with the population of murderers, which is the relevant comparison, you find that actually white people are overrepresented on death row.
Though John Lucio remains adamant that his mother's race, and because she was poor, had everything to do with her not getting a fair trial and landing on death row.
I mean, we're not gonna ever find a rich person on death row.
That is false. Rich people have in fact been sentenced to death. That's just factually wrong.
Do you have an example?
I can't remember the name offhand, but there was a guy in Delaware.
He's speaking about Thomas Capano, a once wealthy Delaware attorney who was sentenced to death after killing his mistress. Though death row statistics indicate that affluent white people on death row are rare compared to impoverished people of color.
They wanted me to admit to something that I was not capable of doing to my child. And the interrogation continued for maybe 7 hours until 3 o'clock in the morning.
Ana Luisa Carrillo Tapia of the League of United Latin American Citizens, or LULAC, has been one of Melissa Lucio's most vocal supporters.
What has been committed against her is an injustice. She's been charged with the murder of a child, when truly and in fact the child fell down the stairs. So what we as LULAC want is for criminal justice reform, to where when you have a charge that is so hard as murder, that they make it mandatory immediately that they get an attorney. Therefore, avoiding that individual, whether it be a woman or a man, from having to incur 5-7 hours of testimony, of questioning. And Melissa had just lost her child. 2 hours later, she's being interrogated, and no less than 100 times that she denied having harmed her baby. No less than 100 times, and they still kept it up.
Melissa Lucio's attorneys say she became so tired she eventually just told police officers what they wanted to hear, saying, quote, "I guess I did it."
Anybody in any mental anguish, anybody with grief is going to eventually just tell you, I guess, so that you can leave that person alone, so they can at least be alone with their grief. But that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're admitting to that crime. They're admitting that they're tired of going through the questioning. They're admitting to that. And when you look at her case, she had nothing but male law enforcement investigators asking and asking, and to the point that one of them said, hey, we all lose it every now and then. So in a way, they were leading her to say, okay, maybe you understand me, I guess let me go ahead and say I'm guilty. But that's not what needs to be done. When you're in law enforcement, you take an oath to serve and protect, not to lead and misdirect.
Texas has executed more than 570 people since 1982, far more than any other U.S. state. Longtime Texas Senator Eddie Lucio Jr., no relations to Melissa Lucio, says he is against the death penalty. As an alternative to the death penalty, he authored and saw passed a Texas law that sentences convicted murderers to life in prison without parole instead of killing them.
We should not be satisfied living in a culture of death. Texas should not take pride in executing people. We have that life without parole. I'm okay with that. And along the way, I've seen a lot of people put to death in Texas. We probably lead the nation by far. And that's nothing to, in my humble opinion, to be proud of, but that's the way it is. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think the Melissa Lucio case should bring in awareness that more has to be done to correct a flawed system, which everybody agrees there is.
The Death Penalty Information Center reports that in 2/3 of overturned death row convictions, official misconduct, perjury, or false accusations played a role in 93.8% of Latino exonerees cases.
It's staggering, and it's, wow. It saddens me to know that you know, it impacts a certain segment of our community. Putting somebody to death is a very serious thing, and I think we ought to do away with the death penalty, because I don't see how we can live later on knowing that we did something wrong and that person was not supposed to die because that person actually was not guilty, was innocent. That has happened also, and it happened. We want to make sure it never happens again the way it happened in Melissa Lucio's case to anyone, whether it's a minority, non-minority, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, to anyone, not only in our country, but anywhere in the world, because we are one earthly family, one American family, and the sooner we understand that, the better.
It is widely believed Melissa Lucio will be exonerated and freed after she is granted a new trial.
And she's going to be the first Latina to walk out of death row.
Ana Luisa Tapia says when Melissa is ultimately freed in the end, as many believe she will be, it will send a powerful message to people of color in her position.
You're not by yourself. There's always somebody standing nearby. Do not be afraid to speak up. Do not be afraid. If us as a people are going to live under fear, we're not living, we're existing. And so many times they look at a Latino person as we need to speak English. We're not only speaking English, we're speaking justice. And we're gonna speak it in English and Espanol and sign language if we learn it, and we need to let the next generation know that it's enough. It's enough. Let's learn these laws, let's learn what our rights are, and let's learn what our responsibilities are so that we don't go through this, so that no other family goes through this.
John Lucio says the justice system in Texas has unjustly kept his mother away from him and his brothers and sisters long enough. Melissa Lucio has not been allowed physical contact with her family during her entire time on death row. Her son John says it's time his mom is allowed to come home.
I'm not gonna say I don't cry. I cry a lot. I cry for my mother almost every day. I mean, I love her and I miss her and we want her home. We have a lot of faith. We have a lot of faith that my mother will come home. How soon we are not too sure, but we believe she's gonna come home.